All right. Hello, everyone. We have a nice big group today. Thank you for joining us. My name is Tony Phelan, Associate Director of Alumni and Parent Engagement. I work in career exploration and alumni engagement at Macalester. We've got a great panel here for you today. I'm joined also by some of my colleagues in career exploration. We've got Kate Erickson, John Mountain, and Amanda Duffy with us. So they're here as well, and hopefully some of you have met some of them before. And then I am going to ask each of our panelists to do a short intro to kick us off. Students, at any point, if you want to ask a question, you can type it in the chat. You can message me directly through the chat if you're kind of like, I don't really feel comfortable unmuting myself or asking it myself or even typing it in the chat myself. I'm happy to ask it for you, and I won't mention your name. So any way that you feel comfortable, you can send those questions off to us, and we'll try to get to as many as we can today. And then make sure that you add your name and your major to the chat really quick, because that's how we're going to know who's here. That's how we're going to get a sense of what majors we're talking to and who attended today. So students, if you just want to type in your name and major, if you want to add your year or other information, that's cool too. And then we will get started. So I'm going to have the panelists introduce themselves just in the order that you're appearing on my screen right now. So Guillermo, if you want to kick us off with a really short intro about yourself, that would be great.
Sure. Hi, everybody. My name is Guillermo Vera. I am a Mac 2016 grad. I was a computer science major at Mac. I'm originally from Venezuela, so I was also an international student. I spent a few years in Costa Rica doing the IB with the United World College program, and I am currently working at Amazon. I was an intern there, and that's how I got my job here, and I've been at Amazon for 4 years now. I started in Austin, and now I live in Seattle. Yeah.
Excellent, thank you. Raven, you're showing up next for me on my screen.
Hi everyone, my name is Raven Jones. I work at Securian Financial and I am a campus recruiter. I've been at Securian for about 4 years, and before that I worked at Sleep Number for a couple of years, and I graduated from the University of Minnesota, Twin Cities, with a degree in communications.
Thank you. Eva?
Hello, everyone. I graduated from Macalester in 2018, so I've been out of school for 2 years, and I work at Deloitte Consulting. I've been here for 2 years. Prior to joining Deloitte, I interned with the National Basketball Association before graduating from Macalester, and then joined Deloitte from there, and I'm based out of Deloitte's San Francisco office. So live on the West Coast.
Great, thank you. Ned?
Hi everyone, my name is Ned. I graduated from Mac in 2017, and I currently work at Google down in Mountain View on the Google Ads team. So I've been there just about 3 years now.
Very cool. And last but not least, Abby.
Yeah, hi everyone. I'm Abby Fisher. I'm the campus recruiter for Boom Lab, which is a local to Minneapolis IT consulting firm. So as a campus recruiter, I work really closely with upcoming and recent grads. I graduated from UW Eau Claire and also spent a couple of years there as an admissions counselor as well.
Great. All right, so I'm going to kick us off with the first question. Panelists, if at any point you feel like you don't really have a good answer to a question, don't feel like you have to answer every single one. No pressure at all, but whoever wants to jump in with an answer right away, feel free. We're going to keep this kind of informal, and we'll kick it off here. So I would love to know, either from a recruiting standpoint or if from an employee standpoint that went through the recruiting process, kind of what the interview process was like for you, the different stages and kind of how all that felt and went, and timelines and things around that. And if you don't, alumni, if you don't remember exactly, that's okay. You can kind of just give us a broad overview. But if anyone wants to touch on that topic, feel free to jump in.
I can start. So for recruiting for Deloitte and for the kind of the big four consulting firms, they typically don't recruit heavily from smaller liberal arts schools, including Macalester. So they have a set of target campuses that they really focus their recruiting efforts on. So in order to get into their recruiting pipeline from a school like Macalester, it's a little more difficult. And so for me, what that looked like was reaching out to the network of Macalester alums who worked at places like Deloitte, like McKinsey, BCBG, and then starting to just have conversations with them to really get to know them. So it's definitely more of an informal, soft networking process at the start to demonstrate that you're interested in consulting generally, why you might be interested specifically in their firm. And then from there, you will start to have more soft conversations with probably managers, senior managers at the firm, and have someone sponsor you to be in the non-target school recruiting pipeline. So once you're in that actual pipeline, what that looks like is a number of case interviews, which I'm sure a lot of you are familiar with. So there's a couple of case interviews that you'll do, at least when I did it remotely with different managers at the firm. And then you'll have a behavioral interview. And if you make it past those couple of rounds of case interviews and behavioral interviews, this was pre-COVID, but they fly you out to a big office, typically somewhere in like the middle of the country, so that it's easy for everyone to get to. And you are then there for 24 to 48 hours with 40 students from a variety of liberal arts schools across the country. You'll have another case interview, a behavioral interview, and then a group case interview to really see how you handle analytics, and then how you also handle interpersonal skills and team situations. That's kind of the general arc of the recruiting process.
I can.
Oh, go ahead.
Go ahead.
You go ahead.
I'll give a different. I want to give a different perspective, because the way I got my job was via an internship. So it's slightly different from applying. It's actually a lot different from applying directly to a job. I applied to be an intern, a software engineer intern, in the winter of 2015 for an internship in the summer of 2015. And I would strongly encourage people, especially in computer science, if you are interested in a job with one of the major companies, I think internships are a good way to getting your foot in the door. Most tech companies will offer you a job at the end of your internship if it was a successful internship. So the way that process was, you fill up a form online. And by the way, before I did any of my applications for an internship, I stopped by the CDC and they helped me with my resume. I really think that helped get my resume to a state that was at least would bring attention to it, because I got a lot of callbacks from companies to do phone interviews. Almost all of them were not good, but Amazon's turned out to be it went well. I was actually my last phone interview, and the only one that accepted me past that point. Once you pass the phone interview, you get the internship, or at least that's what it was back then. I can't imagine it has changed very much. And then the internship itself is like a 3-month-long interview process. It's really tough. You do get like a really serious project to work on. Normally it affects your team and your environment directly. So you get to actually do something meaningful. But it is pretty stressful, although the barrier for entry may be lower. So, if you're really interested in one of the big companies, you should start applying to internships like much earlier than you would think. And then if you want to go through the normal route and apply to jobs or entry-level jobs for computers for software engineering, the process, I haven't really done it myself, but it's a phone screen with a recruiter and then a phone interview with a software developer that will be technical. And then if those two won't go well, then you go to an interview loop where you might have 4 or 5 interviewers for 45 minutes to an hour each. And they will, almost all of them have some important component that is technical. So either algorithms, coding, or some other technical aspect to it. And then after that, you will get your decision. And normally that will be done in person, but now I think it's all remote.
Yeah, I'll just jump in. That's pretty much the same process at Google, like phone interview, then in-person whiteboarding. The other thing I'll mention is just one thought on that is just that these are, your interviewers are just all regular engineers, at least at Google, who like do 1 interview a week or 1 interview a month or something. So, and then they just give feedback that goes up to a hiring committee that looks at like a bunch of different applications and may do some ranking or comparisons, and that's where your like resume and everything else gets taken into consideration. And then from what I've heard, you know, there is some level of flexibility if things don't go well in like 1 or 2 interviews. Sometimes they'll like, you know, they'll bring you on site, do some interviews, and maybe they'll say it's like kind of a borderline case. Maybe you'll do another phone interview with someone. And then I know, at least previously at Google, there's been like this, they have this Eng residency program for new grads who are kind of borderline. So that's where it's like a borderline case, but they think you're probably strong, you know, if you maybe have a bit more experience or something. So you go and it's a kind of like a track to become full-time. I think pretty much everyone gets it afterwards, but you do like a rotation of 3 different teams and then convert to like a full-time on either one of those teams or maybe a different team if you didn't have a good experience there.
I'll just share really quickly our approach for campus recruitment at Boom Lab. We do rely really heavily on career fairs. So as you continue to hear advisors and professors say the importance of being prepared, we absolutely reiterate that. Having a really clean professional resume that you're able to present, having your sort of elevator pitch ready to go, those are all things that really stand out to us. We basically score resumes based off of soft skills and hard skills when we're at the career fairs. So we'll make little notes on your resume directly, and then that's a signal for us recruiters of who we're interested in following up with afterwards. Obviously, knowing things are going to look pretty different this year, I think we will be relying more heavily on traditional applicants coming through our talent inbox via email or LinkedIn, things along those lines. But during a traditional season, the career fair is really where we find a lot of our talent. From there, we then move to a traditional first round interview, just one-on-one with one of our recruiters. And then folks who make it past that initial round are invited in office with us to do a group interview. And that case study is usually in a group of about 4 to 5 applicants at a time. And it's not so much a technical assessment, but much more an opportunity for us to really sit back and just observe you authentically working in a team. What do your communication styles look like? How do you interact with your peers? What type of problem-solving strategies do you utilize? Those are all things that really come into play when we're marketing you to clients. So being able to speak really well to how we've observed you in that setting is so important to us. And then usually at that point, we have a pretty good sense of whether this is a really good fit for you. Once in a while, we might do one more final interview, but typically after that group interview process, we're set to go. So usually from start to finish for an applicant, they would be able to get through the full process in 3 to 4 weeks max, just depending on what works with their schedule in terms of coming in for our office.
I might as well jump in here, but very, very similar to Boom Lab, our process at Securian is we do rely pretty heavily on our career fairs and also engagements with student groups on campus, info sessions, resume review, mock interviews, things like that. That's typically how we obtain our pipeline. But when it comes to the interview process, you will meet with me, the recruiter, for about 30 minutes, and then you will have a competency interview. And competencies for us are going to be things like driving for results, demonstrating responsibility, resilience, things like that. And that'll take about an hour. And then from there, you'll have your technical interview, which would be with the SME of the role that you are applying to. And then we all three have a collaboration session where we talk about each candidate individually, and we have a scoring guide. And basically, if you score over 7 or above, then we will highly consider you, and you'll more than likely get an offer for the position.
Great, thank you all. I just want to ask a follow-up because some of you mentioned kind of case interviews or whiteboard interviews or technical interviews. And some of those terms might be kind of new to some of our students. Some of them may have heard of them before, but not sure how to best prepare. So if you have any overall tips on ways to prepare for a case interview or a whiteboard interview or a technical interview for your area, if you could just briefly touch on that or elaborate a little bit more on that, that would be awesome.
So I think Ned will probably have some similar to say, but for it, at least at Amazon, technical interviews are, you basically get asked a question. I was trying to look at the participants chat to see how many are computer science students. Looks like there's a lot. So you basically get asked the question like implement some sort of data structure or some algorithm that you might be aware of from the algorithms class, but it's not quite in the same way that you studied it. So you have to like kind of find what kind of algorithm they're asking you to do and then write it on the board. And now it's just virtual, but when it was in person, you would do it like actually on a board. And I think that is the hardest thing about this whole process. It's also a skill that you might not necessarily be good at, even though you could be good at the job, right? So it's kind of a hard, for many people, it's hard to break that barrier of entry, and not because their skills aren't there, it's because their like interviewing skills aren't there. So I would, like, one of the things that I think would be really useful if you're planning on going to any tech interview for any tech company is to, one, get really comfortable just like talking to a screen and just like speaking your mind about what you're doing. Just like call a friend and just like ask each other technical questions, Google some like technical questions, and then just go back and forth and like answer them to each other. That's something that I did not do, and I feel like I would have really, it would have been very beneficial for me to have done that. And yeah, so I think that would be like my biggest advice for technical interviews. So I don't know if it's similar at Google, but that's how it works. And
yeah, I think that's definitely, I would definitely was thinking that as well. You definitely need to practice speaking your mind because, I think one aspect of it is like there's this problem and you may be thinking the goal is to solve the problem. And I think that's kind of like a side part of it. I think the more important thing that the person interviewing you is looking for is like, does this person seem like, they're like have strong skills to like break down a problem and like go through it and figure out a solution. So it's like, even if you don't solve all the problems in your interviews, like you can still be a strong candidate if they're like, oh, well, they spent half the time, and breaking it down in this one way that like didn't end up at a solution, but it like shows that they have these like logical thinking skills to like break down the problem in a way that would eventually get to a solution. I think all the engineers understand like given an hour, you might not get to a perfect solution. So, I think like practicing and keeping a level head during the interview is very important. Just like, you're just there to show that you can, think about these problems. And yeah, I think the other thing is just like, it may help you keep that level head to remember that these are just like regular engineers who are doing work. They come answer some emails, they do this interview, they go back and write some code. Like, it's not like a, very intense thing for them. It's, just if that helps you relax, keep that in mind.
One thing that I share with all of the interns that are going to be moving on to the next round to interview with a hiring manager, I tell them to make sure they go back and look at their transcript and think about the projects that they've had in their past classes. That is something that we always ask in our technical interview is, okay, give me an example of a time where you use Python. I mean, that's pretty general, right? I mean, everyone knows Python, right? If you're interviewing for a position that considers that, but it's hard to think on the spot about when you've used that, especially if you maybe did a project your freshman year, right? And you're now a junior. So I always tell students to go back and go to your transcript so that you can have a better understanding of the classes that you've taken and the work that you've done in those classes.
And from a consulting perspective, so consulting relies heavily on the case interviews, and then also what Raven just mentioned, more of the behavioral interviews. There's a lot of the questions like, tell me about a time when, except instead of it being like you used a technical skill, it's more like, tell me a time when you had to lead a team, or tell me about a time when you demonstrated X. So a lot of those prompts are available online through like quick Google searches of like behavioral interview questions, and reviewing those to prepare and practicing with people you know well and who know your resume well is really helpful. And then from a case interview perspective, that usually looks like a real world or a real market problem that you're being asked to solve or demonstrate how you would think about it. So it's more of an exercise in looking at how you consider a problem and how you structure your response. So that prompt might be something along the lines of, you have a company who's trying to increase their like margins in a particular area or drive revenue growth in a particular sector. You're given a couple data points for what the market looks like, and then based on that, you walk through a series of questions about how they can meet their goals and what potential risks are that they should consider. And really what the firms and the interviewers are looking for there is how you structure your response. And there are a number of different guides and classes and books that can help you think about doing that structure and how to set it up so that you create, one of the favorite terms that we use is MICE, so mutually exclusive, collectively exhaustive, making sure that you hit all your buckets and structure your response to show that you've thought through the entire problem. So to prepare for that, what I did was I got a case interview book, and I just like ran through cases over and over and practiced my frameworks to make sure that I really like got the different buckets that consulting was looking for, especially coming from a school like Macalester where we don't have as much exposure to that kind of framework thinking necessarily, that students who are recruited from schools like UC Berkeley might. So that would be my kind of recommendation there.
Yeah, I guess last thing I would add is the way our case study is set up is it's less on the technical side, like I mentioned before. It's essentially a really extensive word problem that you're working together through as a larger group. So I think one thing that stands out a lot to us is general communication skills. So really being self-aware of how are you coming off to your peers? I do think it's a fine balance of you really wanting to showcase your skill set, really wanting to show the interviewer or observer in the room why you would be a valuable match for the company. But we often use the phrase bulldozer. You don't want to bulldoze your peers who you're also working in conjunction with. So really thinking through how you can best show your collaborative skills is something that we focus heavily on.
Great. Thank you all. I would love to hear from some students. If you all have any questions, again, you can just unmute yourself and ask. You can type it in the chat and we can ask it for you. You can use the raise your hand feature, whatever works for you, but I'm going to open it up so you all have a chance to ask some of your questions. Debbie, I see that you have your hand raised if you'd like to go.
Yeah, I have questions for the consulting people because I know that due to the COVID-19, a lot of firms, especially major consulting firms, have already offer full-time offer for their summer interns. So just really curious about what's the fall recruiting will look like for consulting firms, and I guess I don't know if they still have the normal recruiting process, or we're just gonna cut off a lot of people during the fall recruiting. Yeah, so that's my question.
That's a great question. I don't have as much insight as probably a recruiter at Deloitte would have into the appropriate response. But what I've heard is basically along the lines of what you just voiced, is that summer interns are being given full-time offers, but because of the economic conditions, our recruiting this year in the fall is going to look very different, and probably won't be as robust as it might have been in past years. So I'm not sure what it looks like for non-target schools, but that is something that I can look into.
For Boom Lab, we are planning on going forward with a traditional fall recruitment season. Normally for upcoming grads, I guess I should start with saying we don't hire interns, we are just looking for full-time roles. But right now we are still planning on hosting our traditional new associate training classes in June and July. Usually these are about groups of 15 to 20 or so. Normally we also will hold a new associate training class in February, oftentimes to catch any December grads. Again, just given the current economic state, that training class is a little bit more up in the air, but we are definitely feeling hopeful and planning ahead for normal plans for June and July.
Great, thank you. I know things are very up in the air, so we appreciate that insight. Anton, I see that you have your hand raised.
Hi, yes, I have a question to the recruiters. I wanted to know if there is a particular question or a couple of questions that bring most confusion to those people you interview, those that make them think longest, and basically the toughest ones.
I guess one question that I often like to end my interviews with is asking a candidate what they're most proud of. I think it's a little bit untraditional, but gives me a good indication of the level of self-reflection that a candidate has coming in. Oftentimes I'm surprised if they do take a longer pause of really thinking about what accomplishments they've had, either personal or professionally, that they're really proud of. So that's one that comes to mind for me that will once in a while take a candidate off guard.
I have a question about the coding interview. So I've heard a lot of questions about solving practical problems, but will there be questions that are more theoretical, and is how is this data structure different from that data structure? Or
So, sorry, you muted yourself.
Oh, sorry. So I have a question about the coding
That
interview.
yeah.
Yes, and so I've seen a lot of interview asking us to solve practical problems, but will there be theoretical question? And is like how this data structure is different from that data structure.
I think it depends a little bit on the company and the interviewer. At Amazon, they might ask you direct questions about data structures and about algorithms, but most of the time it will be a larger project where you're expected to discover these things as you go. So, you might start working on a project on a your solution and pick a list as your data structure, and then realize that maybe a list isn't the best, and so then you're expected to like say or note this and say, oh, actually I think we might be better off if we use a set here, right? And then the interviewer might ask some probing questions about your data structure knowledge, but for the most part it's about, at least at Amazon, it's how you can use this data structures, and not if you know like the differences between them. And the other thing that it might change is there are some interviews that aren't strictly algorithms or data structures. They might be more like design. It's usually not expected for campus recruitment to do like maybe not even one design interview in the loop, but you might be asked about how you would, on a higher level, on a higher abstraction level, how you would make something work without actually having to write the nitty-gritty code for it. This is something that I've noticed that in schools and at Mac too, it's kind of hard to get this skill of designing. It's something that I definitely had to learn on the job. And so it might be something to like also prepare for. And I can go a little bit more into what like designing means, if that's something you're interested in. I see Ned unmuted himself, so I think he wants to also chime in. Go ahead, Ned.
Yeah, I was just gonna say, I think I know sometimes they ask like within that, like those like word problems where you're supposed to find the data structure. Sometimes I think there's like a minor design component at like the new grad level where it might be like beforehand, if you're thinking about the problem, it's good to say like, think about like various aspects, like, okay, we have this, say we're getting a list of numbers, do we have to think about the list being like billions big or something? I think there are small, I think sometimes those small design pieces come in at the campus level. But yeah, I'm not sure about like, at least at Google, I don't think campus level, like new grad level, gets like a pure design question, at least in my experience.
Yeah, same at Amazon. I don't think we have like direct questions about that. I think it's mostly algorithms and data structure problems. That said, you're not expected to actually, like, they won't ask you like what is the difference between a list and a set, and they won't ask you like, they might ask you things like what is the time complexity of inserting into a map, right? But that will come as a follow-up question once you use the map in your solution normally. So basically you have to know your data structures that you're going to be using in your project, in your solution, because they will ask probing questions about them.
Thank you. We have a question in the chat that I think it's a big question, but it's an important question. So coming from your perspectives, and we've touched on this a little bit already, but how does full-time recruitment look different than summer internship recruitment? And then now that COVID has hit, what have you kind of seen change as far as recruitment? I know that some of you mentioned, the recruiters mentioned career fairs, and I know that some of those are shifted or not happening anymore. So any insight into in the here and now, kind of how students can best prepare for fall recruiting.
Go ahead, Raven.
Same time. Again, I was just going to say that we do focus pretty heavily on career fairs, and now that those are virtual, it's nice that I'm actually a fan of virtual career fairs. I've never done one before, but I like the format of it because the employer will have a chance to have a, some schools will allow this, but you have a chance to have a info session at the same time as having one-on-one slots. So you will have 10 one-on-one slots with each student, while you'll have a info session that goes for 1 hour on the hour. And so that's a really nice way. In Securian, we plan to utilize that info session to have folks from our diversity team, folks from our associate resource groups, which would be like women in STEM, LGBT, our multicultural group, things like that, to come and speak to more so about the culture of Securian, which you don't really get at a career fair. I mean, it's what, like 3 or 4 minutes, right? That you're talking to a recruiter and you wait in line to just have 3 or 4 minutes. So I'm very excited about the new format. And one thing that I typically tell students when they're preparing for a career fair is just take at least an hour of your time before the career fair, go through the employers that are going to be present, and just learn maybe 1 or 2 things about the company. That is something that it kind of takes you back a little bit when you're talking to a student and they're like, okay, so what does your company do? Or like they mispronounce the name, and you don't want to make a bad first impression right away. So just take, once again, an hour, I always say pick your top 5 companies that you definitely want to talk to, figure out a little bit about their company, maybe 1 or 2 key things that you want to highlight just to show that you've done some research, right? And then also have an idea of the openings that they have, so that you can at least come to the table with, I see that you had a data science internship and I'm really interested in that. And also if you could tell me a little bit more about your cybersecurity internship. It just shows that you have some skin in the game and that you've done a little bit of homework and research on the company prior to.
Yeah, just adding on to that, I would say knowing that a lot of companies are going to be looking at perhaps smaller training classes or fewer opportunities, that level of preparedness, I think, is just going to be even more important than previous years. So like Raven mentioned, doing your homework ahead of time, having your sort of selling points about yourself ready to go is really going to be key. But I also think keeping in mind in a virtual setting, there are some other things to be prepared for as well. So still being dressed professionally, making sure that your background is also professional. That's going to be part of that first impression that you're making. If you might be having internet issues, trying to get those sorted out ahead of time. So I think that list of sort of boxes to check to make sure you're fully prepared looks a little bit different now as well.
All right, we had another question come in directly to me in the chat. So I think this is a good one just kind of for everyone. So for students who their resume has internship and work experience from a variety of fields, how can a candidate best articulate level of commitment towards a certain career path, for example, consulting, when their resume doesn't necessarily reflect that, or it has a more eclectic feel to it? So I guess how would you recommend students kind of tell their story if maybe their experience doesn't fully reflect the jobs that they're applying to? I hope that makes sense. But if anyone wants to speak to that, that would be great.
I can speak to that because I actually had that exact same conundrum when I was applying to consulting jobs. I think the approach that I took was really actually playing up the value that an education like Macalester brings. So the fact that you guys all have really unique experiences having gone to a liberal arts school, because it means that you've had the opportunity to learn to think in different ways and to have those different experiences. So I think something that is sometimes overlooked or undervalued when applying to consulting jobs in particular, is that there's a lot of emphasis on like having this framework and having like the strong like math and economics background. But I think that the flip side to that is that if consulting firms hire everyone who has the exact same experiences, you don't get diversity of thought. And that's extremely important when you're solving business problems and going to clients across the globe, to be able to look at a problem from a different perspective. And so I think that playing up the fact that you do have different experiences across different industries or doing different things is actually really valuable if you can find the common thread that connects them. And usually that common thread can run somewhere along the lines of having a strong analytical background. So across all the different internships or jobs that you've had, what types of analysis were you doing? Or across all those different jobs and internships, how have you consistently demonstrated that you're leading teams or you're taking on leadership positions, or you're examining a problem in a new way and really trying to get to a solution. So finding that common theme that connects your different experiences, but still maintaining that they are different, I think is really valuable because it shows that you're adaptable, and that you're able to look at a variety of different problems, and bring that unique perspective.
Thank you. Anyone else want to jump in on that one? I didn't mean to cut you off if you were jumping in. Okay. I have one, and I don't mean to put you on the spot, career counselors, but if you want to jump in on this one, but and panelists, you as well, but what are some things, so all of these industries kind of have slightly different interview processes and different ways to kind of get your foot in the door, but the one thing that they have in common is that they recruit early, which is why we're having this session. So if a student is hoping to get their foot in the door in finance or consulting or tech, what are some things that they should be doing, starting now to make sure that they're prepared for the fall recruiting season? I know that that's a really broad question, but it's, for students who maybe aren't in these industries, they might not be looking at jobs until February, March, whereas it all kind of happens right when we come back to campus or come back to classes in this case. So yeah, any tips that you all have for keeping on top of things because they're going to come up quickly?
I can talk a little bit about, this was already touched on, but practicing the case or technical interviews, walking through that with friends, even if your friends are not interested in that, but being able to communicate your thoughts. Even if it's, not focusing on getting the right answer, but being able to communicate your thoughts to somebody else is really important. And so on the career exploration website, under the interviewing tab, we have resources for technical interviews. Also, I would lean very heavily on our alumni who are open to practicing with you all. And we on that tab of interviewing, who have said, absolutely reach out to me. I'd love to practice with students or just kind of walk through that. And so leaning on the resources that you already have, and practicing more than you think you need to, just because it's really hard to know what questions they're going to ask you, but it's really easy just to practice and get used to answering questions or getting it wrong and then pivoting and being able to talk through that, which is really important.
Yeah, I would echo some of those same things. I think just getting, especially like with case interviews, it's just hard to just jump in cold to it because there is kind of a rhythm or thinking about how would I solve this problem, or even with technical interviews, just kind of getting through that process. It's hard just to do it cold and doing it for the first time. You got to struggle through it. And I always say it's better to struggle with a friend as you're practicing, with our office, as with one of the counselors, and kind of getting some of those bumps in the road out of the way before it really matters, I think is really critical. Same way too, just leaning on our office a bit too, as far as tightening up the resume and just kind of getting some feedback just so your materials are ready to go. And then again, as Amanda mentioned, just with the alumni, I think can be really helpful because I think it's powerful when you're in the interview and the recruiter asks you, so what about, why are you interested in our organization, right? It's a fundamental question of why you're there. And if you can then, it's a big difference. Well, I think it's a great company, right? It seems like it's a good deal, or you're ranked number 2 in this or that. It's like, they don't care about that. It's like, but if you can talk about the 3 alums that you've met with in different locations and what the common themes were, or what really resonated with you, now that feels much more powerful than you just finding it on the website and applying, and you're more invested. And I think that comes across in the interviewing process.
As a former student that had to like do technical interviews, I can't stress enough that you should absolutely practice all these things. I made a big mistake of applying to a whole bunch of internships, and I applied probably to like 30 companies. I had a notepad. I would just go and like keep writing names as I thought of them, and then systematically applied to all of them. And I used those as my practice interviews, and that went as good as you can imagine, right? It was terrible. And then finally, my last interview went kind of okay, and that was with Amazon. I was kind of lucky because it was in March, and normally just apply much earlier to internships, like, you know, maybe around winter break, maybe even earlier. So yeah, fall of 2015, of 2014, I spent it applying to a whole bunch of companies and doing interviews and failing at all of them. And then only my last one went okay. So definitely 100% practice. I think that's one of the most important things for technical interviews. And it sounds like same for case interviews.
Yeah. And I think we see as counselors, you guys are bright enough to figure it out. You get way better as you're doing it. So I see this massive improvement from the first case interview to the third or the fourth, right? And you get it. It's not hard necessarily, but the process is different. And so you've got to just run through it a few times. But then you do see that improvement. And so we just don't want you to have that first, maybe not so great experience be the one that really counts. Better to practice with us, practice with alums, practice with just your friends before it actually matters.
I'm going to take a second before we get too close to the end. Panelists, if you would be willing to share your contact info in the chat, or however you would prefer for students to reach out to you if they have follow-up questions after this, that would be great. I just wanted to say that now so students have a chance to write it down if they want to reach out to one of you specifically about that certain industry or a specific question they have about the company you work for, because I know that we've been kind of asking more broad general questions during the session. So I want to make sure that they know how to contact you if they have more specific ones. I'm going to open it up. We have time for maybe 1 or 2 more questions. So students, if you have anything that you want to make sure you get answered, feel free to jump in. If not, I have some too. So. Okay, I'm not seeing anyone. So I would love to know, and you can kind of take this from either perspective. Recruiters, you can take it from this perspective of what is a common mistake that you see candidates make that could be easily corrected and kind of help them in the interview process or the hiring process in general. And then alums, you could kind of take it from the perspective of what is one thing, and Guillermo, you touched on this a little bit before, what is one thing that you wish someone had told you as you were going through this process and you're like, oh, if I had just known that up front, it would have made it a lot easier. And we've talked a lot about interviews, so if there's something else, maybe not the actual interview process, but something else that you want to share with students, that'd be awesome.
I mentioned this earlier, but don't wait too long to apply. I don't know what the recruiter's perspective is on this, but for tech internships, the window, at least when I was applying, was from like the middle of the fall semester to the middle of the spring semester. So you know, a month before graduating is kind of too late for a lot of places, at least a lot of big companies in tech. So definitely early is better. Something that I was lucky because I started early, but not because anybody told me. So I wish somebody had.
Yeah, and just to jump on that, so we post all of our Securian, we post our internships at the beginning of September, and then our fall recruiting season ends typically in October, early November, so right before Thanksgiving. And being super honest, we do a lot of heavily recruiting in the fall, and we don't do much recruiting in the spring because thankfully we've filled most of our positions. And so the positions that we do need to fill in the spring, it's because we maybe have had a decline, right, from one of our top candidates for our fall recruiting season, but most of our recruiting is done in the fall. So I would say start even earlier, probably in August. So right now what you're doing and looking at those companies and seeing if they have any postings out.
Yeah, I'd really recommend spending a significant time on your resume. Again, since we won't be able to have that interaction in person this year, the resume is what we'll be heavily relying on. So one of the biggest mistakes that I see from candidates is not being very thorough, maybe only including 2 to 3 bullet points. But then when I have a conversation with them, there are so many other important skill sets that they could have hit on that would have been great to know earlier. So really relying on your Career Center advisors to chat through what that looks like for you. Oftentimes when I'm working with a candidate or doing a resume review, I have them just do a brain dump of every single thing that they did day to day in that internship, and then really can work with them on shaping up what does that look like in terms of a professional bullet point to include on the resume. So I really encourage students, spend a lot of time. You have done more in your internship than maybe what you think. My guess is it is more than 2 to 3 bullet points. So spending a significant time on that can make a huge difference from a recruiter's end.
One thing that kind of reminds me of is just, and maybe I'm not sure how this is for all recruiters, but at least at Google, in what I didn't realize when I was applying was that the recruiter you're working with is really your advocate in more ways than it seemed apparent to me initially. And like I know at least one other person who he was going through the interview process, and I think he got a decline, but he felt like, at least for one of his on-site interviews, like I think the person came really late, so he felt like he really didn't get a fair shake, and is able to work with the recruiter to get another phone screen to add as another data point in his packet. So I think that's just something good to keep in mind.
I think on that note, something that I didn't realize that would have probably been very helpful was knowing that every interaction you have with someone at the company or companies you're interested in applying to, while not necessarily an interview, is really important in contributing to your final, the company's final overall decision and impression of you. So even if you're just talking to alumni, or if you're talking to perhaps a colleague of an alumni who referred you to talk to them, every interaction that you have just to learn about that company is being noted and has an impact on how your resume and your overall application is viewed. So definitely treat those as informal interviews, and to really showcase that you are a good candidate, even if it's just an informal conversation exploring your interest.
All right. Well, thank you all so much. I want to be respectful of everyone's time. I know there's a couple of questions that we didn't get to in the chat, and I'm sure not even just in the chat, but people have some questions that are coming up now. But so I apologize that we weren't able to get to all of them, but that is why we have had the panelists share their contact information in the chat. And also a lot of these questions our office can help you with too. So I'd encourage you to reach out to the panelists, reach out to our career counselors, reach out to Career Exploration, and you can always ask us those questions too. But like I said, I know that we're coming up on time. So I just want to thank all of our panelists. If we could give them a virtual round of applause, that would be great. Thank you everyone for your time and for your great questions. Students, keep an eye on the events calendar because we've got a lot of great things coming up this fall. We're totally here for you. Alumni and recruiters, thank you so much for offering your great advice today. And hopefully we can do some more sessions like this in the future. But yeah, I hope you all stay well and have a great rest of your day. And everyone be sure to check the chat for that contact info. And thanks to my team for being here for support as well. So, all right. Bye, everyone.
Thank you.
Thank you, Tony. Thank you, everybody.
Thank you.